Welcome back to The Explainer. Today, we're diving straight into something absolutely fascinating. Billionaire investor Ray Dalio's macroeconomic framework, and specifically his 2022 Country Power Index. You know, geopolitics is usually incredibly noisy, right? But what Dalio tries to do here is strip all of that noise away. He's actually attempting to quantify the rise and fall of entire nations into cold, hard data. It's like a giant puzzle, and we're going to put the pieces together.
So here's our roadmap for today. We'll start with what Dalio calls the chess computer of history, then move into the long-term debt cycle, check out the actual global power index, zoom in on the top two players, the USA and China, and finally ask ourselves, is this groundbreaking or just obvious history? Let's jump in.
Part 1. The chess computer of history.
Okay, so Dalio frames his whole methodology with this really fascinating analogy. He says, imagine you're a chess player, right? And you build a computerized version of your own brain to play the game. It has perfect memory, instant processing power, but literally zero common sense. Well, that's exactly what he did with the history of 24 leading nations. He basically automated the historical cause and effect relationships just to see what the raw, unfeeling data would predict, without any human bias getting in the way. Now, the computer actually tracks 18 distinct determinants of power. But these right here, these are the big five, the absolute heavyweights. We're looking at the long-term debt cycle, internal order, external order, the pace of innovation, and, you guessed it, acts of nature like pandemics or droughts. The idea is that when these five line up and start moving in the exact same direction, they basically dictate the entire overarching trajectory of a nation's economy.
All right, moving on to part 2. The long-term debt cycle. So what is a long-term debt cycle? Simply put, it's a macroeconomic pattern that plays out over an immense time frame. We're talking 50 to 75 years. It is heavily driven by the expansion and contraction of money and credit. But here's the catch, and this is absolutely crucial. Because this cycle takes longer than a single human lifetime to complete, people almost always miss the pattern. We just naturally assume the economic environment we were born into is a permanent reality, rather than just one passing phase of a much larger, highly predictable loop.
Let's break down this loop. It all starts with immense trust. Step 1 is hard money. Think assets with actual intrinsic value, like gold or silver. But carrying around heavy gold is a total pain, so an economy inevitably evolves to step 2, paper claims that are linked to that gold, which of course opens the door wide open for step 3, debt. Banks quickly figure out, hey, we can lend out way more paper currency than the physical gold we actually have sitting in the vault. And boom, this sparks a massive, highly leveraged economic expansion. Everyone feels rich, asset prices soar, and times are good.
But you know, that leverage inevitably breaks. It always does. In step 4, borrowers start defaulting on those massive debt burdens. To avoid a total systemic collapse, central banks are basically forced to print money. This pushes us into step 5. Fiat money. The link to hard assets is completely severed, which lets governments just inflate their debt away through endless printing. And finally, we hit step 6. Trust completely evaporates, currency devaluation triggers massive capital flight right back into hard, tangible assets. The whole system resets, and the cycle violently starts all over again. Which brings us to part 3, the Global Power Index. So when you feed all these cycles into Dalio's algorithm, this is what spits out. The definitive top 6 global powers of 2022. The USA holds the #1 spot with a massive 0.89 empire score, but notice the computer flags its trajectory as a gradual decline. Right on its heels, we've got China at 0.76, but showing a rapid ascent. The rest of the board, the Eurozone, Germany, Japan, and Korea, they're effectively all just fighting for a distant third. And to truly grasp the gravity of this geopolitical landscape, we just need to isolate the top 3. Look at the spread. The USA commands 40% of that concentrated power score, China holds 34%, and the Eurozone takes 26%. Dalio's algorithm essentially reveals a massive power vacuum between the big two and the rest of the entire world. It's really quite staggering when you see it laid out like that.
Let's zoom in on that dynamic in part 4, the top 2, USA and China.
The crucial point here is understanding the algorithmic why behind these rankings. What's driving them? On the US side, the model calculates a highly unfavorable debt cycle. We're talking high debt burdens combined with expected low real growth and pairs that with massive internal risk. But it offsets this with incredibly dominant capital markets, reserve currency status, and top-tier innovation. On the flip side, China displays a very favorable economic position, booming infrastructure and robust global trade. However, the algorithm drags China's overall score down because of a weak reserve currency status and lower scores in governance and the rule of law.
Let's isolate a critical vulnerability for a second. -2.2. This is the USA's Z-score for internal conflict. Now, statistically speaking, this is a severe outlier. It's a very high-risk reading. Driven by hyperpartisanship, widening wealth gaps, and civil unrest, the computer basically flags this internal friction as the primary anchor that is dragging down the U.S. trajectory right now. Now contrast that internal friction with this metric, 2.6. That is China's Z-score for infrastructure and investment. This very strong reading reflects massive, centralized capital being aggressively deployed to essentially build the physical future of the country. According to the algorithmic model, this is the primary engine fueling China's rapid ascent.
And finally, part 5. Groundbreaking or obvious history. All right, let's look at a pretty harsh critique of all this from journalist Murtaza Hussain. He wrote, "If you've seen the meme floating around, bad times create strong men create good times, you have learned more than you will from this book." Ouch, right? Hussain is essentially arguing that Dalio is just taking very obvious historical truisms, that empires rise, get indebted, become decadent, face internal divisions, and eventually fall, and repackaging them as this unique, never-before-heard insight. He thinks the grand theory is really just a shiny reinvention of ancient cycles.
But, even severe critics like Hussain concede one absolutely crucial point. Dalio's presentation is ruthlessly effective. Reviewers everywhere heavily praise the bullet point investor briefing format. By stripping away all that academic fluff and just highlighting the pure data, Dalio created a highly practical heuristic. So even if you think the underlying macro theory isn't entirely novel, the visual packaging of such massive amounts of complex global data, it is undeniably useful.
Which leaves us with a final question for you to weigh. After seeing how Dalio's algorithm quantifies debt, internal conflict, and infrastructure to actually rank global power, what do you think? Is this computerized index the ultimate predictive tool for the future of our global economy? Or is it simply a highly organized mirror reflecting the exact same ancient cycles of human nature repeating themselves yet again?